This is Radio City Music Hall in New York City, one of the most famous movie theaters in the world. Here, on July 14, 1955, a Thursday evening, there occurred the premiere of a film that would eventually become a bona fide classic, the World War II comedy Mr. Roberts, starring Henry Fonda, James Cagney, and Jack Lemmon in an iconic performance that won him the first of his 2 Academy Awards. Perhaps you've seen Mr. Roberts. It pops up on Turner Classic Movies and other streaming services pretty frequently. Mr. Roberts is a much beloved movie. Even today, 68 years after its release, it has a 93% critic score and 85% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. I've loved this film since I was a kid. I even saw a production of the play it was based on. My parents took me to it when I was about 12 because I was such a huge fan of the movie. But as beloved and important as this film is, let's face it, Mr. Roberts has some pretty dark origins and associations. And not just the film's troubled production history, which I will talk about, but also something deeper. It's intimately connected to the tragic experience of World War II veterans and how broader American society failed to understand them and to help them reassimilate back into society. You may be surprised to learn that the author of the book on which the play and the movie were based, Thomas Heggen, died very young in 1949, possibly a suicide. Mr. Roberts was the only thing he wrote. But that's just the beginning of the darkness in the Mr. Roberts story. This video is a deep dive on Mr. Roberts, its historical context, and what it means. It may challenge your thinking about this film and about the truth of the so-called greatest generation of veterans who fought World War II and came back like Thomas Heggen did, quite changed. Let's take a close look at an enduring classic and see what we can learn from it. Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian, author, and teacher. I've been doing a lot of deep dive videos on my channel lately, and some involve popular movies. This video started its life as an article that I wrote for my old Substack blog in 2021. My Substack blog is no longer active, so I reran the article on my new blog and newsletter, The Garden of Memory. The link is in the description. Please do sign up for the newsletter if you're interested. I do a lot of articles on various historical and cultural topics. There are some spoilers here. If you haven't seen Mr. Roberts, come on, it came out in 1955. What are you waiting for? But I do disclose the ending here. And in terms of content, we do have to talk very briefly about what happened to Thomas Heggen. So if suicide is a problematic topic for you, you might want to skip this one, or at least skip chapter 4. The chapters in this video are clearly marked in the description. But first, the movie itself. Mr. Roberts is best described as a comedy with dramatic elements. It takes place in the spring and summer of 1945 aboard a U.S. Navy cargo ship, the USS Reluctant, called the Bucket by the crew, which drifts around the Pacific Theater delivering mundane supplies like toothpaste and toilet paper to other Navy ships. Executive Officer Douglas Roberts, played by Henry Fonda, is the guy who basically runs the ship and who shields the long-suffering crew from petty tyrannies and mindless bullying of the narcissistic Captain Morton, played by James Cagney. The captain is a needling and abusive man who revels in punishing others because he can, along with a wisecracking doctor, played by William Powell, and the colorful rogue Ensign Pulver, played by Jack Lemmon, in a career-defining performance. The movie takes us through various episodes aboard the Reluctant, most of which focus on how much the enlisted men of the crew adore and worship Mr. Roberts. The plot's major arc, such as it is that Roberts desperately wants a transfer to combat duty, but he has no hope of getting it, so long as Captain Morton refuses to approve his transfer requests. Roberts eventually makes a deal with the captain to allow the crew to have a Liberty, R&R, vacation, in an exotic South Pacific port, if Roberts stops talking back to the captain and also ceases making transfer requests. The deal is secret, but at the end, the crew discovers its existence. They repay Roberts by forging the captain's signature on a transfer request, which is finally granted. Roberts goes to a combat ship, but at the end of the film it's revealed via a letter that he's been killed in the Battle of Okinawa in a Japanese kamikaze attack. A major subplot of the film involves a potted palm tree. Captain Morton won it as some sort of prize for the efficiency of the crew in delivering cargo, and he keeps it on the deck just below the bridge. At a crucial point of the plot, Mr. Roberts grabs the palm tree and throws it overboard as his last remaining statement of rebellion against the captain. The captain replaces the tree only to have it thrown overboard again at the end by Ensign Pulver after he finds out about Mr. Roberts' death. The obvious implication is that Pulver has now replaced the dead Mr. Roberts as the advocate for the crew, and the captain has gained nothing by getting Roberts off the ship. The central element of the story, the dynamic that powers the whole thing, is Mr. Roberts' advocacy for the crew against the petty villainy of the captain. Captain Morton's orders and requests are continually seen as unreasonable. He puts men on report, a disciplinary list for tiny infractions. He won't let them work with shirts off even when it's roasting hot. He withholds privileges like shipboard movies and recreation. The biggest thing is that he's reluctant to let them go ashore, the liberty that the big deal with Roberts hinges on. The story never explains why the captain is like this. Through it all, Roberts constantly talks back to the captain and blunts the effects of his orders, which enrages him. There's obviously a class dynamic between the captain and Mr. Roberts. Morton is apparently a career merchant mariner, while Roberts was drafted or enlisted when the war began. Morton continually sneers and belittles Roberts for having a college education. The palm tree is important because it's the visible symbol of the captain's tyranny, a benefit that he received based on the hard work that the crew did. The emotional center of the movie is the scene where the crew is saying goodbye to Mr. Roberts. In fact, this was even depicted on one of the film's original posters. They give him a homemade medal called the Order of the Palm, commemorating what he did for them. What's interesting is that the wording on the medal, read aloud on screen, includes the phrase, action against the enemy. The enemy here is not the Japanese. It's intended to refer to the captain. In the letter Roberts sends the crew just before his death, he says he'd rather have this award than the Congressional Medal of Honor. There's more to the film and more subtext. In the article on my blog, for instance, I discuss the considerable misogyny embedded in the story. Women are treated as an alien species, and the whole liberty sequence is highly problematic. I don't need to go into that here, but it's in the article if you want to read it. Link is in the description. Mr. Roberts had a rocky road to the screen. The original director was John Ford, the legendary Hollywood auteur who made classic pictures like Stagecoach and How Green Was My Valley before World War II, and then during and after it, he made several films about the conflict, especially involving John Wayne, such as They Were Expendable from 1945. Ford was a crotchety old bastard. He was recently portrayed in the Steven Spielberg film The Fabelmans, and he didn't get along with stars Henry Fonda and especially James Cagney. There was constant tension and arguments on the set. Midway through production, which took place mostly in Hawaii, Ford suffered a gallbladder attack and had to get urgent medical attention. This is the official reason he was fired from Mr. Roberts, but the tension with the stars might have been part of it too. Veteran director Mervyn LeRoy took over for Ford. Incredibly, though, there was also a third director, uncredited, Joshua Logan. He directed some of the scenes that Henry Fonda apparently requested be reshot. Fans of the film continually debate which scenes were done by which of the three directors. Released into theaters in the summer of 1955, Mr. Roberts was a huge hit. It grossed $21 million, that's in 1955 dollars, the equivalent of about $238 million in today's dollars, so a pretty big success and a great return on a $2.3 million investment. It was the second highest grossing film at the American box office for the year 1955, behind only Cinerama Holiday, which was a specialty picture that demoed the super widescreen technology called Cinerama. The film was a career high point for Henry Fonda and especially Jack Lemmon, who was vaunted into stardom by the picture. Mr. Roberts was also the last film made by William Powell, who had gained fame in the 1930s as Detective Nick Charles in the Thin Man pictures. Mr. Roberts, the film, is based on a play which premiered on Broadway on February 18, 1948. The play was also hugely successful. It ran for more than 1,000 performances in its initial exhibition. Henry Fonda played the title character on stage too. In fact, he had to get out of a movie contract specifically so he could do this production. The Broadway play was directed by Joshua Logan, one of the 3 directors of the film. The play was itself based on a novel published in 1946. There were actually 2 books called Mr. Roberts, but the first one was the source of the whole phenomenon. After the play came out in 1948, author Thomas Heggen wrote another version, which is basically a novelization of the play. The novel, Mr. Roberts, the original 1946 one, is kind of meandering and plotless, which is sort of what you would expect. Thomas Heggen was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, and the book was largely autobiographical, cobbled together from incidents that he wrote down while serving aboard the cargo ship USS Virgo. Apparently there was a real Mr. Roberts, a composite of officers Charles Roberts and Donald House, whom Heggen knew during his service in the Navy. There was also a real Captain Morton, in actuality Lieutenant Commander Herbert Randall, who really did have a palm tree that his executive officer threw overboard. So, although the novel, the play, and the film are technically fictional, they do have some considerable relationship to historical fact. The main model for the bucket in the story and the real ship that Thomas Heggen served on was the USS Virgo, which was technically an attack cargo ship. I didn't know such a thing existed, but apparently they did. The Virgo carried troops and equipment to various combat zones in the Pacific, including the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Heggen also served aboard the USS Rotanin, another cargo ship, not an attack cargo ship. Most of what Heggen saw during the war involved, as you'd expect from Mr. Roberts, loading and unloading of cargo and supplies. In the novel Mr. Roberts, the character Roberts joins the Navy not even realizing that cargo distribution is a thing in the Navy, which partially explains why he's so disillusioned that he's not involved in combat. This is where some historical context comes in handy. The United States' principal strategy in World War II was to overwhelm the enemy with vast amounts of stuff, not just bullets, bombers, ships, and tanks, but equipment, trucks, and especially supplies, material stuff that America's vast industrial capacity could churn out at a rate that the Axis powers couldn't hope to match. It's not that winning battles in the field wasn't important, clearly it was, but the United States had such an overwhelming material advantage in terms of supplying its armed forces that the gigantic train of support materials that followed American troops into battle everywhere they went made it a whole lot more likely that they would win those battles, compared to the Germans and Japanese, who were fighting a global war on a shoestring budget with highly limited resources, especially toward the end of the war. To get all that stuff where it needed to go, however, the American military needed an absolutely vast logistical support network, especially in the Pacific, where the theater of war was spread out over tens of thousands of miles of empty ocean, dotted occasionally with tiny islands. Thus, we had to have a colossal armada of cargo and delivery vessels that vastly dwarfed the number of combat ships engaged against the Japanese. You need toothpaste and toilet paper to fight a global war just as much as you need bullets or torpedoes. Heggen seemed to understand this. At one point in Mr. Roberts, the Doc character talks about the bucket doing a very necessary job. He's right, although the point seems a bit lost on Roberts himself. The unmistakable theme of Mr. Roberts is the crushing boredom that was the lot of most American servicemen who took part in the Pacific War. An oft-quoted line of the movie, taken almost verbatim from the book, is that the reluctant sails from tedium to apathy with an occasional side trip to monotony. This, not the pulse-pounding combat engaged in by a tiny sliver of people in the U.S. Armed Forces in World War II, was the most overwhelmingly common experience of Americans who served in that war. To me, this resonates. Those of us who have grown up in America in the decades since World War II have a seriously warped view of what it and the people who fought and served in it were like. Our view was warped principally by pop culture and media, particularly movies. While the war was going on, Hollywood, at the insistence of the federal government, pumped out propaganda films, stressing how the war was a Manichaean struggle between good and evil, and how important it was that democracy prevailed over dark fascism. John Ford, who co-directed Mr. Roberts, excelled at stuff like this. World War II films of the 1950s and 60s stressed the heroic dimensions of the conflict. Pictures like Hellcats of the Navy, which starred Ronald Reagan, and The Longest Day recreated battles and built stars like Reagan and John Wayne into the embodiments of valor. For both viewers of the World War II generation and younger people, there were more or less light-hearted adventure movies about World War II, like The Guns of Navarone or Where Eagles Dare. Especially if you're Generation X, as I am, you probably remember these kinds of pictures. They came on UHF TV on Saturday afternoons a lot. Quentin Tarantino parodied them in his 2009 film Inglourious Basterds. These movies were fun, but they not only obscured the reality of the conflict, but spun an alternate version of it, which was much more comforting and easier to buy into than to engage in any sustained reflection on what really happened. In reality, Mr. Roberts is a far more realistic depiction of World War II than virtually all other movies made about it in the 1950s and 60s. I know because my grandfather served in the Navy in the Pacific War on an LST, that means landing ship tank. He was not involved in combat. He never saw a Japanese soldier. His experience was very much like the downtrodden crewman in Mr. Roberts. Endless days of crushing routine and boredom and chafing under the yoke of authority. Kind of like the crewman of the bucket, my grandfather resented the officers in charge. He went AWOL twice and was a habitual screw-up in the Navy. Had my grandfather ever met Thomas Heggen, he might have gotten along with him, if he could have stood being friends with an officer. As the film Mr. Roberts demonstrates, there was a huge and very glaring class difference between officers and enlisted men. When the book Mr. Roberts became a hit, Thomas Heggen, who was only 26 when World War II ended in 1945, suddenly found himself part of a budding literary cohort of young American men of letters, all military veterans, who made a splash writing about their war experiences before the 1940s ended. I'm amazed by this photo, where you can see several of them. That is Heggen right there. But the others include Alfred Hayes, who wrote a novel, All Thy Conquests, in 1947. It's set in Rome during the Allied invasion of Italy. This is Irwin Shaw, who wrote The Young Lions, a 1948 novel, about the experience of American Jews during the war in Europe. He later went on to write Rich Man, Poor Man, which was made into a popular TV miniseries in the 70s. That is John Horne Burns, who wrote The Gallery, a 1947 novel set in Italy and North Africa during the war. And this is James Michener, possibly the most well-known of the writers in this picture. Michener had a long career as a novelist, writing numerous lavish epics, usually family sagas about a particular place, Poland, Chesapeake, and Hawaii among them, but his first claim to fame was the 1947 short story collection Tales of the South Pacific, which was loosely adapted into the 1948 Rodgers and Hammerstein musical South Pacific, written by Joshua Logan, who would go on to co-direct the Mr. Roberts movie. Missing from this picture, but definitely in the same literary cohort, are two other important writers of the World War II era. James Jones was most famous for the novel From Here to Eternity, in my opinion the best ever American World War II novel, And he also wrote 2 sequels, The Thin Red Line and Whistle. Then there was Herman Wouk, who also served in the Pacific Theater and wrote The Caine Mutiny, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1951. Wouk went on to write the epic World War II novels The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, both made into miniseries in the 1980s. If you can believe it, Wouk died only 4 years ago in 2019 at the age of 103. All of these writers had illustrious careers, except Thomas Heggen. Mr. Roberts, the book and later the play, was the only substantive thing he wrote. It was a huge hit, granted, and at one point Heggen was pulling in over $4,000 a week from royalties, a princely sum in 1948. But he was crippled by writer's block, which drove him into alcoholism and depression. The pressure to crank out another bestseller literally killed him. On May 19, 1949, Thomas Heggen was found dead in the bathtub of his New York City apartment. The official report was that he drowned accidentally, but he swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills before getting in the bath. His friends and family insisted that it was not suicide, that it was an accident, but we might be splitting hairs here. Heggen was only 30. This was an incredible and tragic waste of an immense young talent. Was Heggen traumatized by the war? It seems like he must have been, but he didn't talk about it publicly. Today, in the 21st century, we're keenly aware of the issue of military veterans and suicide. And yes, I'm putting on the screen there and in the description the number that you can text in the U.S., 988, if you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts. Such a service that we have now might have been able to save Thomas Heggen if they had it back in 1949, but they didn't. Whatever the reasons for Heggen's death, whether accidental or not, the world was robbed of whatever else he might have been able to write. Perhaps there was a World War II novel somewhere inside of him that might have been even bigger and better than Mr. Roberts, maybe surpassing even From Here to Eternity, if he'd given it a chance. In any event, we'll never know. Maybe this is a controversial reading, but I think the subtext of Mr. Roberts demonstrates how American society misperceived and largely failed World War II veterans. Few people who didn't serve in the war understood what a life destroyer it could have been for the men and women who did. Think about it. Imagine being 20, your whole life ahead of you, and then everything is derailed by a ghastly, civilization-shaking conflict in which the survival of your nation is at stake, in which you have to drop everything in your life to go off and fight. Then in 1945, the conflict ends in victory, at least for the Allied side, and you return home to find everything different and little left of your old life. You're still 23, 24, and the most important thing you'll ever do in your life in most cases is already over. What do you do with the rest of your life? Not to mention, if you're traumatized, you can't talk about it and will get no help. You didn't have to be in combat to be traumatized. I know this again from the experience of my grandfather. My grandfather rarely discussed his war experiences, but when he did, he talked mainly about the boredom aboard the LST. Then in 1998, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he told me about an incident where he and others aboard his ship were in the ship's radio shack, listening to radio transmissions from an American aerial attack going on nearby. They heard in real time a pilot who was hit by Japanese fire and went down to his death in his plane. They listened to him dying on the radio, and my grandfather said it was the most horrible thing he had ever heard. My grandfather never saw a Japanese soldier, but that didn't mean that the war didn't traumatize him. Who knows what other experiences that might have been lurking in his past that he never talked about. Thomas Heggen might also have gone through something like this. But even if he didn't, there's still that big question. What happens when you return home at age 25 or 26 with the most consequential thing you'll do in your life over with? How do you go back to working at a bank or a construction site or a soda fountain after that? How do you reassimilate back into society? Those questions were taken up by 2 iconic films that came out in 1946, the year Thomas Heggen wrote Mr. Roberts. The first was William Wyler's seminal film The Best Years of Our Lives, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1946, and dealt with the stories of veterans, one of them disabled, trying to reacclimate to civilian life. The other film was Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, which is today remembered mostly as a Christmas movie, but its purpose in 1946 was to encourage just returned war veterans to find value in the ordinary civilian lives that they returned to, or perhaps, like the James Stewart character, they never left while the war was on. Of course, as Heggen's experience demonstrates, finding a reason to carry on wasn't as simple as seeing a feel-good movie. But how could you explain that to the people who hadn't gone through the wartime experience themselves? As I said, the engine that drives the plot of Mr. Roberts is the admiration the crew feels for him. All the members of the Bucket's crew, from the crotchety petty officer Dowdy to the wild and crazy Reber and the boyish twink Bookser, all of them feel a sense of camaraderie with each other, as they're all thrown together in suffering against the captain, and they also have their patron saint, Mr. Roberts, looking out for them. When the war is over, though, and all these guys go back to civilian life, there won't be a Mr. Roberts there who has their backs. The war was horrible and boring, but you can see how these guys might, in future years, look back on it with a certain sense of longing. We, the greater society who did not serve or fight in World War II or weren't even alive at the time, never got it. In fact, we brutalized the World War II generation all over again at the end of their lives in the 1990s and 2000s by deciding to cast them as golden heroes who saved civilization. We dubbed them the greatest generation. We doffed hats and lowered flags in their presence and made glowing TV documentaries and hero-worshipping pap like Saving Private Ryan about them. They never wanted that. I never knew a single World War II veteran who wasn't grossly uncomfortable with the whole greatest generation mythology. I know it's supposed to be a classic war film, but I find Saving Private Ryan insufferable because of the horrendously cringeworthy Greatest Generation stuff that suffuses it. So, after ignoring and misunderstanding their trauma for decades, suddenly we appropriated the survivors of the World War II generation as marble demigods whose awe-inspiring sacrifice should humble mere mortals. Who could live up to that kind of deification? No real person could. No thank you, Tom Brokaw and Steven Spielberg, but I would like to remember my grandfather just as he was, not as some sort of heroic superhero. He was a plumber from San Jose, California. Thankfully, we're now passing out of the period when the Greatest Generation was the go-to interpretation of the World War II experience. But it's too late for most of the veterans, the vast majority of whom are now dead. We buried them with honors. I was present, for example, at my grandfather's funeral in 2013, but we never took the time to understand them or to look seriously at what they'd been through. Not long ago, after the last time I watched Mr. Roberts, I want to stress again that despite its problems and its dark associations, it's a very enjoyable film. Anyway, I tried to put myself in the place of one of those crewmen who'd been aboard the USS Virgo during the war, and who might have been the sailors that Heggen described in his novel. What would it be like for them, say in the mid-1950s, a decade after the war, still dealing with unresolved trauma, working an ordinary job, struggling to raise a family, and still feeling misunderstood and misplaced? A man in this position might pine for the days that he spent aboard that terrible rusty bucket, where, although the work was boring, at least he knew, or thought he knew, that Mr. Roberts was his patron saint who would never let him down. There was certainty there, and belonging, and simplicity. That this nostalgia is born in a large measure out of anguish and cynicism is easy to forget when you're guffawing at the 1950s dad jokes being emitted glibly in Mr. Roberts by Dick Powell and Jack Lemmon. While we can't know, perhaps Thomas Heggen's last thoughts took him back to the days of the war aboard the Virgo and that warm certainty that part of him pined for. Mr. Roberts is a comedy farce, but the more you think about it, the more it seems a little like tragedy. I want to thank my growing number of subscribers who come back for every video, especially the long ones. I appreciate you. If this is your first video from me, check out some of the other stuff that I've got, including deep dives on various subjects: Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, the Iran-Contra affair, the meaning of the Titanic disaster, or historical analyses of popular movies, like Gladiator or Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. If you like this video, do all the stuff you normally do for a video you like. Hit the subscribe button, the bell, you know the drill. And thank you all again for joining me on another journey into the past.